So welcome, and we'll start with Chris Jackson, who's going to talk here on science and spirituality. Hi, Chris.
Hello. So I'm also going to start with a little anecdote about how the day progressed, because when I was writing this talk, mostly, in all honesty, this morning when I arrived mega early, I had this very, very serious talk about how important it is that we work moving forward in a way that allows these paths of sciences, the natural sciences, and spirituality, or mythical sciences as they've been referred to so far, to work coherently and synergistically in a way that is sort of co-facilitative. A lot of this has stemmed from 6-ish years ago when I started to write a teacher training program. And I began to write a teacher training program mostly out of frustration from attending training programs and only ever being taught style. And I had all these questions about why and how does it relate to this. My training prior was in psychology and psychotherapy and neuroscience. So to me, there were all these commonalities that were just sort of brushed under the rug, and this is our school, this is how we do it, it works. And I was like, that's not good enough for me. So it took me 4 years all in all to write this training, and every year we rewrite it. And I thought that process was the thing that sort of made me analyze what's important to me more than anything else. And then a year ago, my wife had a little boy. And oh my God, that made me think about what was important to me. And our system since then is becoming increasingly simple. But anyway, science and spirituality. Peter's already referred to the catastrophe that he referred to of the Nos, attempt to regulate yoga. And I think that there's a misunderstanding that actually the natural sciences are themselves very well ordered and very well regulated and packaged. But actually they disagree with each other just as much as yoga might disagree with, say, chemistry. And really it becomes about the perspective from which you look at it. And perhaps if I spoke to my co-speaker next to me, he would describe me as a standing wave. Maybe not. Maybe that shows my ignorance of astrophysics, quite probably. If I spoke a little bit further down the line, then he might describe me as an organic interlinked system. He might describe me as a series of electrically controlled levers and little more. And perhaps someone else would describe me as a manifestation of spirit, and someone else, pure illusion. Something that's there to teach them some kind of lesson. I might be your... that person that you fell out of school projected up here on the screen for you to disagree with. So to regulate then becomes almost a moot point, because where do we begin? Where do we begin? Like Peter said, in a spectrum so broad, in a service industry as well. I like to think that as a yoga teacher, as a yoga trainer, I'm working in a service industry. And that therefore, first and foremost, is the needs of the group that I'm catering to. I think then our starting point rather should be to look for commonality between the various approaches to treatment, to life, to meditation, however you want to phrase it. In 1973, Merton published a paper in which he analyzed what he considered were the aims of science. And he put them under these 4 categories. The first of which was universalism, the quest for general laws. And immediately within this system, there is also the need to forget those general laws, because, as was said this morning, those general laws will create a map, they'll create a rough view of the territory, but no one will experience that map in the same way. So universalism is only beneficial insofar as it allows us to meet someone at a place where we can then begin to specialize. The second level then he lists as organization, which is the beginning of this process of structuring that information. We have general laws about gravity, for example. It's going to apply to your yoga class. We have laws about biomechanics. We have laws about the breath. We have these generalized sequences, perhaps. But actually, unless we organize them in a way that's relevant to that individual, they're useless. And third, and for me one of the most important, and one for me that I certainly felt was missed in my early days training, was skepticism. And skepticism not as a negative critique, but actually as a hunger to always be playing devil's advocate with your own beliefs. I think that constantly questioning what you're doing should be the norm. And the final is communalism, which is sort of where I started. This idea that these laws, although operating in their own field, will have some point of access whereby each individual can tap into it, draw out what they need in order to facilitate their growth, and then feed back into that same pool. Where I feel like this goes awry in maybe what we would call the yoga industrial complex, is branding, is relabeling things. Whereas actually, I agree with what both of our panelists said this morning. We need to keep that language of Sanskrit alive. But if the person on the mat in front of you is a returning war veteran, and they've been seeing a psychotherapist, and they've begun to make progress, then you need to meet them at that language point, and then feed them into wherever your capacity is going to take them. So for me, the ability to, as Mark was saying, sort of break down those cultural barriers isn't so much about the student's experience, but really more about my responsibility to have a broad enough understanding that when that potentially vulnerable individual comes under my domain, if you like, that I have the breadth of knowledge, but also the specificity of knowledge to adequately support them through whatever period of time I have with them. I think then, if I were to put a specific term that differentiated the most valuable essence of science, as we sort of broadly understand it as a term, and how we need to bring it into this spiritual dimension, is the empirical testing of conjecture. The idea that we can take something that we've learned from an incomplete knowledge base and then approach it with what John Dewey would call competent inquiry. And actually, should we not, as yoga teachers, have a real advantage here? When we've been studying ourselves for years. Hopefully, if our practice is going well, we're aware of at least some of our agendas, at least some of our colorings and our veils and our unconscious drives. Like Sylviane said, we're probably not going to reach all of them. But if we can take that personal objectivity into a global objectivity in our study, then I think we begin to open up very exciting avenues for research, but also for therapeutic practice. So I'm going to have to skip a whole ton of stuff. One scholar that I'm particularly fond of is Buckminster Fuller. And I imagine that some of you are familiar with his work. And one thing that Buckminster Fuller writes is that the truth will always be inherently convergent. That if there is one universal truth, that I believe that there is, and I imagine that many of you believe that there is, whether you believe that as a dualistic or non-dual interpretation of the divine, then any theory that is based on truth will at some point become accommodating. It's impossible for two things to be the same thing and for them not to work together. that doesn't mean that there won't be moments of contradiction, moments of polarity. And that's the nature of being human. But actually, when we get to the core of it, all of these studies are just seeking out truth. Buckminster Fuller also said that you won't create change by chipping away at what already is there, but rather you need to start with a new, I've lost it now, a new paradigm that encompasses everything else in it so completely that it simultaneously renders them obsolete and central. And Thomas Kuhn floated this idea of a paradigm shift as the ultimate solution to the demarcation problem, this continuing philosophical issue between religion and science. Oh, what can we empirically test? What can't we empirically test? Actually, is it even valuable to empirically test? And there's a wonderful quote by Susan Hack that says, actually, sometimes we can research things just for the sake of researching things and contribute nothing. A lot of the time, we're researching things that have already been well and truly researched, but under a different filing system, a different title. And if we had a paradigm shift that allowed those different truths to be accessible from a central axiom of some kind, then, one, we would save ourselves a hell of a lot of time. But two, we would have the possibility of genuine forward movement. As Buckminster Fuller says, from the egocentrically selfish stage of human development that he considers us in now, to the syntropically cooperative stage of human development that he sees as a possibility for us, or saw, perhaps I should say. I'm going to go into this next topic because I have time. Perhaps the most inspiring researcher that I've come across since I've been thinking in this way, or at least been trying to think in this way, is the work of the spiritual psychologist Ken Wilber. And if you would like to have this next section in the full depth that it deserves, his book, Integral Psychology, or The Religion of Tomorrow, and together they're about a metric ton of literature, but they're wonderful, they're so thorough. And what he does is he separates spirituality into two components. And these two paths he calls the path of waking up and the path of growing up. Are you guys familiar with this? No? Oh, good. So the path of waking up is the traditional spiritual path that deals with taking you towards individual enlightenment. Right? Oh, not individual enlightenment, as we might think. And that this can happen spontaneously, it can happen at any point, it can happen after years and years of work. But through developmental research, what they've also identified cross-culturally, and this is all beautifully documented in the book, is a universal set of stages of growing up. And actually, the stage of growing up that you're in, when you experience your waking up experience, is perhaps the most important thing.
You have a minute left.
I have a minute left. The first stage, which I'm going to go really quickly, takes us right back to Buckminster Fuller's egocentrically selfish. It's infantile primacy. And this four-stage model, it's called the egocentric stage. And this isn't a stage whereby the person is callous or deliberately unconsiderate of others, but genuinely incapable of seeing the worldview from any other perspective but that egocentric stage of development. You don't look at a baby and think, oh my God, they're selfish. You know, you think he's a baby being a baby. And eventually he'll get to about 4 and he'll start to understand the next stage, which is ethnocentric. And ethnocentric is when we begin to move out to a group. 15 seconds. We move to a group, but actually there's still this sense of us and them. So we achieve our enlightenment experience in this ethnocentric stage And it's still bound by those rules. We still believe that we can only ascertain this as a direct result of the ethnocentric situation we're in. And then after that, we move into integrative stages. And if we can get people to grow up, as well as getting them to wake up, then we're going to have some profound philosophy. That's okay. But if we negate that necessity to consider the developmental aspects, the scientific aspects, the multiple intelligences that have co-evolved to create this system, then we sell ourselves short.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Hold your questions and write them down as we go on to Mark Westmore-Kay, who's going to talk on moving inward.
Great. Okay. Hello. Welcome. So I'm from the Zenways organization, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we can start to use some of our understanding from the wider sort of universe side of things to inquire about some of the experiences that we have in our internal practice. And maybe sort of trying to sort of make a bridge or understand it. I thought it was very interesting that you were mentioning earlier today how we can start to demystify some of the esoteric sort of experiences or language and things. Maybe it's sort of in that similar area that we're going to be looking at. So can we... Yeah. I feel like I'm a bit of a baby in terms of where my practice is. Speaking to the people at lunchtime and hearing from the people this morning, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got into yoga and some of the sort of twists and turns along the way. So I hope you bear with me just for a few minutes. I got into yoga when I first went to university in about 2000, and I was quite into target rifle shooting. So this is the picture here. Long-range target rifle, we're shooting at paper targets. And I remember reading a book, and the book said it'll be really useful if you have a movement practice. Helps with body control, breath control, and things like that. And one of the suggestions was yoga. And I thought, there's a yoga class at the gym, I'll just go along. Yeah. And I started to, do a bit of yoga. And now I was a pretty signed-up, hardcore scientist at the time, and I'd just gone to university to start studying astrophysics. And so I was, I struggled a little bit with some of the aspects of yoga which didn't fit into my scientific worldview at the time. But I did appreciate the physical challenge, and I understood the breath control, and it really helped with the shooting. I ended up on the GB under-25 team, so it seems to helped a bit anyway. Yeah. So if we just... So this is me a little few years later. I did a PhD in astrophysics, and I ended up doing about 10 years of research before I... so this is me down in Chile, actually, outside the big telescope complex in the desert up on the mountain. So, I sort of struggled mostly with the concepts around energy and chi and prana and meditation and that kind of... I've really found it very woo-woo, if that's a concept, if that's an idea that makes any sense. And maybe I think a lot of people, in my experience now as a teacher, come to this as a bit like, well, what is this weird stuff? We have this weird words for it, and people talk about it, but it's so far away from our daily experience that, it all seems a bit like, out there. So, if we go forward a few years, about 2009, I went on a retreat where I had my first experience of actually feeling movement of energy in my body. And it was, to where I was at that time, it was completely blew me away. Blew me apart in my understanding of my inner experience. I had kind of like jolting, and it was kind of electrical feelings, and, it was very pleasurable. And it was something that I just never come across before. I'd come across people who talked about it, And I always thought, well, are they making it up? But, when you experience it in your body for the first time, you cannot deny it. Okay, so, I don't know, I was maybe 10 years as a scientist before I shifted out of that, and now I teach yoga, and now I'm a Dharma teacher with the Zenways Sangha. And I've been trying to sort of figure out my experience, how people talk about energy and prana, and how the science can start to help us understand it a little bit. And I'm just going to talk about some of the things that I've found out through my experience, and I'll be very interested and welcome to hear some other thoughts or opinions or whatever, maybe afterwards. Okay, yeah. So in the science world, when we talk about energy, there are maybe various different forms of energy. So we have what we might call electromagnetic energy, which is we've got lightning, but we've also got light. We've also got like your mobile phone reception, radio, TV, that kind of thing. Then we have kinetic or thermal energy, and this is the energy of movement. And, we have movement as in bodies moving about, cars, but also heat. Heat is like a vibration of particles. We have nuclear energy, and that's where we tap into the energy of right in the atom, and we can start to use those kind of forces. And then we have like potential energy, things that may happen in the future. So, for example, if I hold this piece of paper up here, it has potential energy because it will fall to the ground. Then we have elastic energy, like when you draw a bow, or like chemical energy, which is what we're processing in our bodies right now from lunch. This kind of chemicals that we take on board, it goes through our metabolic system. Yeah, so if we look inside the body, then we have all of these things. So I'm sure this thing is very obvious. We take in oxygen, we take in food, which gets converted into glucose, and this molecule ATP, which makes the muscles move. And then we have maybe energy in terms of information, which gets passed through the body in hormones, and we have these adrenaline, serotonin, dopamine, all that kind of things. Yeah. Okay. We have a lot of chemical and thermal heat, probably a lot of hot air that comes out, particularly of my mouth right now, probably. Yeah. We have electrical energy, and now I'm just going to spend a little bit of time having a look at this. It's very interesting. A variety of different kinds of electrical energy in the body. So we have the things that bind our molecules and our atoms together. So, for example, salt is made of sodium and chloride and chlorine, and they have a positive and negative charge, and they're bound together through electrical energy. We then have all the nerves, and we have these electrical impulses which travel down through the nerves. There's kind of like a charge exchange which happens as it goes in and out of the cell body, and then we get this pulse that goes down. And we have them, of course, everywhere. So we have energy, electrical energy passing through the whole body. And, you can measure it easily through EEGs and ECGs and things like that, where you get the pulse. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Then we have a whole area which has kind of got a little bit of interest in the last 5 or 10 years, maybe 10 or 15 years or so, in the area of fascia. And so it's a very interesting substance, fascia, how it's made. It's made of a protein, which we call collagen, and it's bound into this triple helix structure in such a way that makes it very strong and also makes it a semiconductor. It's a crystal, it's a semi-crystal, like what you get in your old calculator screens, like that same idea. But because it's a semiconductor, it means it can conduct electricity under certain circumstances. And those circumstances are when the body is experiencing compression or stress, compression or tension. And those electrical signals pass through the fascia, and actually the fascia listens to that and knows where to build and where to weaken and where to strengthen. And just like the bones, the bones and the material around the bones are constantly in a dynamic, active kind of process of building and shifting. And that's to do with this electrical signal that passes through. So we have this two separate systems of electrical energy in the body. We have the nerves, and the fact that we have these charge exchanges which happen, pulses through the nerves. And then we have the fascia, and they're independent. The electrical pulses which travel through the fascia are not under nervous system control, and they're only due to physical compression and tension forces. Yeah. There was an interesting study a couple of years back where they looked at the slices through the upper arm here and going through the shoulder down to the elbow. And they looked at the correspondence between the fascial planes, so the bits of fascia that wrap the muscles, that correspond around the joints and things, how they correspond to the meridian lines and the acupoints on the meridian lines. And they found quite a strong correlation. Yeah. Particularly where the points are, seems to be where the planes interact, or where they sort of cross and wrap around the different muscles of the upper arm. So there's a correspondence there. Mm-hmm. Then there's been some work on looking at the connections around the body of the fascial sort of tissues. And so the work, for example, of Tom Myers, I don't know if anyone's come across this book, Anatomy Trained. I suspect it might be quite familiar, yeah. So where he was looking at the different connections, lines of stress and tension in the body, and came up with a number of what he called Myofascial Meridians. And it's no surprise he took that word meridians, because we have the lines of longitude and latitude, meridian lines on the Earth's surface, just like we have these lines of connection and energy in the body. And of course the Chinese energy lines, which we also call meridians for the same reason, they're lines through the body. And also there's a very strong correspondence between what Tom Myers has found, the different fascial lines, and also the meridian Chinese energy lines. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's this kind of play between the different kinds of energy we've got in the body and how it moves around, how it's connected. Yeah. So we can perhaps think about this kind of fascial connection, tension, and compression forces in terms of mechanical energy, like how stress and tension is distributed and pulled around inside the body. And we can diagnose postures and movements, sequences, asanas, and vinyasas through its effect on this mechanical energy transmission through the body. It's a very interesting area, where this whole idea of science and the kind of the wisdom that's passed down can have quite a lot of crossover and kind of talk. Yeah, great. Then the last kind of energy I wanted to mention was the energy of intention. And as far as I can understand, intention is where we bring together all of these different physical forms of energy and direct it under our will, or our consciousness. And there are kind of some, you'd probably say that everything in this whole room, in fact, everything you've come across today has been touched by human intention at some point. So it's a very powerful force. But what is it? Intention. It's a kind of it's an energy, right? Because it's an energy of communication, of intent, of will, if you like, yeah. Mm-hmm. So we have in in my tradition, people often talk about how energy follows intention. Like where you put your mind, your energy goes. Makes sense, huh? Because that's how the body moves, yeah. There's this beautiful book, The Spark in the Machine. Has anyone come across that? Yeah, Daniel Cohen, his name is. And he talks about the very direct correlation between the Chinese energy lines and some of the sort of Western medicine. He has the title, How the Science of Acupuncture Explains the Mysteries of Western Medicine. I think that's a nice way of putting it, yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think that, as far as I've understood, the jolts that you feel in your body, sometimes when you get that kind of energetic response, is where the electrical system in the body comes into coherence, and then we get a kind of, the body becomes a whole and one. And then the electrical energy is able to pass in particular channels, and it causes the muscles to start to move. If the channels are perhaps not quite so clear, we get a lot of movement, and if they're more clear, then they start to move more freely. That's sort of my understanding of it. Mm. So I think some people like the fact that prana and chi is mysterious. And I think probably it brings some people to yoga practice, because there's this whole mystery about it. This deeper, what is it? How do we even know it? But from my experience for having studied the universe and, the big scales, then I think my awe of the universe has only grown through understanding how it works. and understanding how little we actually do know about it, and the sort of vast, complex nature of the universe. So I think that understanding chi or prana through this scientific way doesn't in any way degrade it or water it down. I think it's such an important area that we can start to bring across the languages, if you like, as we were saying before, but like kind of peeling away the barriers of this esoteric language so that people can have something a little bit more direct to get hold of. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to perhaps say that we could move as a yoga community towards science in this way. I think that yoga has done a lot in terms of research towards the physical side of things, illnesses and conditions and diseases and things, and how yoga can really help with that. But if we bring some scientific understanding to the energy side of things, that can open a whole new area as well. The mindfulness community has done well with the awareness and the sort of presence research. Maybe we've got a bit more to go on that side of things. Mm-hmm. So maybe we could say that the pranic body is nothing more than just all of the energy moving inside the pranic body is nothing more than just the energy, of all these science things. Or you could say that the pranic body is nothing less than the entire universe and all of its contents and energy and complexity moving through us, as a being. So you mentioned before we've got maybe a little bit of time after the alarm goes, 1 minute. I'd like to invite us all to do a little meditation. So if you perhaps just arrange your body in any way that you'd like to, just make sure you're comfortable, and with your eyes a little bit lowered or closed, just bringing your attention into your body. Can you sense the conversion of chemical energy of your lunch happening in your body? Can you sense any other kinds of energy moving in your body? Maybe heat, maybe weight, can you sense the electrical impulses that are moving through your thoughts, your mind, memories, sounds? The energy of the entire universe manifesting in your body right here. And then taking a nice deep breath. Lovely. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Now we have Andreia Newman talking on human evolution and yoga. Are you staying a bit?
I can see now. Is this going to be too high for me? I'm only little. Thank you. Okay. The future of yoga. It's a big topic, isn't it? I'd like to... yoga has been with me almost all my life in some form or other, and it's given me so much. It's supported me. It's given me opportunities to learn and heal, and I can't understand how people can live without it, really. I can't. But just for now, I want to put it to one side a little bit and think about people, because people is what I'm really interested in, us human beings. And I've been studying human beings for a long time, and I've been one for quite a long time now. And I think human beings are fascinating. Really annoying sometimes as well, but very intriguing. And what is it about us? What is it about us that makes us different from the rest of that animal kingdom? When I think about my dog, she's intelligent. She can even do a little bit of problem solving. She can communicate with me. Obviously, she can't speak, but we have a form of communication. But she's not. I don't think she ever asks herself, "Who am I?" or those kinds of questions like, "Who am I? What's the meaning of life? Why do I have to suffer? Can I get around suffering?" That kind of thing. So, although she's a sentient being, and I believe that she is conscious, there is some difference. There is something different there. So, there is something that we have. I don't like to call it consciousness. Maybe self-awareness. Maybe self-awareness is a better term to use. And these questions that we ask, they're the questions that have led to religions and philosophies, aren't there? Yoga being one important one, but there are lots of others as well around the globe. So I think if we're thinking about the future, we know that we can never, when we make a choice and we decide to do something, we can never predict 100% what the outcome is going to be. So all we can do is our karma yoga. All we can do is to make choices with good intention and a good heart, and hope that good things will come of it. But that isn't necessarily the case. If we think about the future, it can only ever be a prediction or a wish, really, can't it? Nothing more than that. So, as the previous speakers have said, it's very much about being present, isn't it? Making decisions now to the best that we can with the information that we have. But I think it's also interesting to look back to the past and to look back at how we've evolved, because we've evolved in a particular way. We're wired in a particular way, which sets the context for now, and the decisions that we're making now. Why are we destroying the planet, for example? You know, we've come to this point. So I wanted to just quickly run through. I need paper for this because it's about numbers, and I'm not really a numbers person. I'm more of a narrative person, but I will give you some numbers. If you're interested, this comes from the New Scientist website, if you want to look it up. 55 million years ago, quite a long time ago, the first primitive primates were on Earth. So those little, I think they were quite little primates that are the common ancestor that we have. The apes, the great apes have, the monkeys have, and all the apes that have died out, and all the humans that have died out as well. That is the common ancestor, the first primitive primate, 55 million years ago. So long time ago. I can't quite get my head around that, but 55 million years ago. Fast forward a long time to 5.8 million years ago, and we find the oldest human ancestors, and they were walking on two legs. Apparently, they were walking on two legs back then, and they were forest dwelling. 4 million years ago, the first humans ancestors found living in the savannah, so living in the desert. So they'd come out of the forest, they'd come out of the jungles and were living in the deserts. That's a huge change, really big change. And if you want to survive in the desert, on the plains, it's very different from surviving in the forests. And it becomes much more important to be connected with other people. It's safe. It's not safe to be on your own out in the open. Skipping forward, 1.8 to 1.5 million years ago, Homo erectus came out of Africa in large numbers. Apparently a lot of them are found in Asia. And around this time there was evidence of use of fire as well. 500,000 years ago, so 500,000 years ago, the earliest purpose-built shelters were found. 230,000 years ago, Neanderthals appear. 195,000 years ago, Homo sapiens appear. and start to migrate to Asia and Europe. 170,000 years ago, Mitochondrial Eve. Have you heard of her? She's our common ancestor, so all of us surviving humans are related back to her, apparently, so we're told. 150,000 years ago, humans were probably capable of speech. They may not be speaking yet, but they had the equipment in their throat to be able to speak, unlike my dog. Now, this is the bit that interests me. 110,000 years ago, beads and jewellery were found. And to me, that means that that's something different, because the animals don't make jewellery, as far as I know. They don't. Maybe some of those birds with their fancy nests, but they don't really decorate their bodies. And 50,000 years ago, there was a lot of rapid development in our evolution, and people were starting to bury their dead, and there's evidence of ritual around the burial. So it suggests some kind of religious activity or religious thinking. They were also making clothes at that time. Okay, so we're coming much closer to the present day now. 33,000 years ago, the oldest cave art is found. So they were making art, again, something that an animal doesn't do. 28,000 years ago, the Neanderthals die out, except we know they interbred, and a lot of us have actually got Neanderthal genes, haven't we? And 5,500 years ago, the Bronze Age. 5,000 years ago, the earliest known writing. And 4,000 years ago, the first civilizations, so the first big settlements and towns. So we can perhaps suppose that we started to get this self-awareness around about 50 to 100,000 years ago. It's not that long ago, really. 50,000 years ago is about 2,000 generations. 6 years is 2,000 days. It's not. To me, it's not that long when you think about how far we've come from developing speech to getting to this point now where we have so many different languages, all the literature we have, all the religions, all the philosophical thinking that we have. And also thinking about the brain as well, we have the neocortex, the outer layer of the brain, which is our thinking brain, which allows us to think in the way that we do. We have the limbic system in the centre of the brain, which is what we share with all the other mammals. So that's an older part of the brain. And then the oldest part of the brain is the reptilian brain, the brain stem, which we share with the reptiles. Okay, so back then we needed to survive. That was number one. We needed to survive. And we are all descendants of the survivors. Many, many, many didn't survive. There were many different species of humans that never made it. There is only one species left on Earth that we know of, and that is us. We inherited an amazing ability to digest a very wide range of foods. A lot of animals can only digest certain amounts of food. If we only ate bamboo shoots, we wouldn't have been able to spread around the globe in the way that we have done. But we also have this need to be in groups. In order to survive, we needed to be in groups. So we developed very strong bonds. And in the same way that when we haven't got food, we feel a great hunger. And that hunger gives us the desire to go out and find the food. In the same way that if we're on our own and we're not connected with other people, we have a hunger. And we don't have a word for it in English, and I think we need to invent one because it's a really real thing, that we have a hunger to be connected, and we have this great problem with loneliness, don't we? I think that word loneliness is slightly problematic. There's some negative connotations, but lots of people in our society living on their own, not feeling connected. Our ancestors had great diversity. And that's one of the reasons why they survived. Because if you take a small group of people or take a group of 50, 100 people, within that group, there's huge diversity. I mean, if we just look at the group in this room, and the talks this morning were all so different, all fantastic, but different, weren't they? And so if a group of human beings is in a difficult situation, there'll be somebody who can step in, somebody who's got the skills or got an idea to sort it out. So one of our great strengths as humans is we have this huge diversity. One of the problems with that is that we have some individuals who may be sociopathic, psychopathic, the criminals, words that I don't even want to use, and people that we tend to put away in prisons. And on the other end of the scale, we have very kind people who are full-time carers, people who are who give their lives for other people, and the whole spectrum in between. And it's a problem, isn't it? We don't know how to deal with it. We tend to call people bad people. We label them as bad people. We cut them off and we put them away. But actually, they're part of our humanness. And somehow, I think the future of humanity has got to be tied up with embracing the whole of humanity and how are we going to deal with this, And we have structures in our society which aren't working. They're starting to break down. They're starting to fail. They're based on old-fashioned patriarchal systems of hierarchy and having power over others. People wanting to have power over others and doing whatever they need to do in order to get that power. It's not working. So we need other ways. We need the diversity. We need people with imagination, and I think if yoga people can't pull it together and be an example for the world, then who can? And we have a number of organisations, quite a lot of organisations, yoga organisations in this country, and all of them are different. They're all really good in their own way, and they all have different functions, they have different types of membership, they do different things. And wouldn't it be great if we could all collaborate together in a kind of not to be the same, but to be a web, to be a network, instead of saying one is bad, one is good, so on. And I think we can do it. I'm sure we can do it. And we need to be creative, and we need to think of different ways of working. And I don't think those ways have been thought of yet. But we've got to find them. And just like in evolution, where lots of the previous humans and the other species died out, ideas die out too. And we might come up with ideas that don't work, but we have to come up with lots of ideas that don't work to find the ones that do. So I like to encourage everybody to set up organisations in different ways, and see what works. Personally, I've been trying to work much more collaboratively with people over the last few years, and the cake is cooked, and it's great. It's really hard work working with other people. I worked alone. I taught alone for a long time. And now I don't teach alone much at all now. I work with others. It's hard work. And people are difficult to work. But it's really well worth persevering with it, talking about it, getting through the issues, and setting up different systems that work. And I'm sure the yoga community can find a way forward, not just in yoga, but for the future of the world.
And we have Pete Blackaby, who's going to talk on... Sorry, did I say that right? Blackaby. Doesn't matter, right?
I'll respond to anything.
Very good. Very good. He's going to talk on secular yoga.
Secular yoga, it could have been secular skeptical yoga. It's difficult if you're naturally a skeptic, if you're secular, to practice yoga. because so many of the things you bump into your own belief systems, and you have to try and fathom your way through. And I'd like to thank both Chris and Mark and Andreia for helping me out, listening to them. Mark talked about skepticism and competent inquiry, and I thought that was nice, something I try and practice. And Mark talked about something I've never had, an energetic experience. I've practiced yoga for 40 years, and I've never had one of these experiences, and I've often felt slightly sad about that. And in fact, I remember teaching a yoga day some years ago, about 10, 15 years ago. I thought it was rather a good day. And at the end, there was a questions and answers session, and someone shouted out, "Pete, what about the chakras?" And I felt a bit paralyzed, a bit like when my 7-year-old son said, "Dad, does Father Christmas exist?" I thought, what do I say? And I bottled out a bit. I said, "Well, I've never felt one." And I left it at that. And that's where these kind of things make me feel uncomfortable. If I can't teach something I don't experience. That's something I feel profoundly true. I can't invent things that I don't know. But I worry, I puzzle, I agitate in my mind about these things. Some things help me out. I came late because my train was cancelled, and just as Swamiji was talking about circularity of time, and it made me think, that most of us in the West don't think like that. We think in a linear way, and I don't know which way's right and which way's wrong, but they will certainly give you a different perspective, particularly if you weight it in a different way. Andreia has just talked about human evolution, from coming out of the trees to the kind of society we've got now. You see there a sense of, arguably a sense of progress, something that is developed. In yoga, I believe the move from the 4 periods in time, from Satya Yuga to the Kali Yuga, is more of a decline. If you think of those two things, and you're thinking of the circularity of time where there was a golden age, your tendency will be to look back to find truth. And that would make sense for that culture. It doesn't make much sense, if you think time is linear, to look back to my Neolithic ancestors and try and find truth there. So for the West, there is more the perception that the wisdom lies at the front of the timeline, and maybe in yoga the wisdom is in the rear of the timeline, and that orientates the way we organize our thoughts and the way we look. And I don't want to judge which way is right and which way is wrong, but I think if you can contextualize that, you can understand each other, you can appreciate each other's position. And I'm interested that we understand each other, not try and say one way is right, one way is wrong. So that helped me make some sense of why there is a dissonance between my views and some other people's views. It's not that they're right or I'm right, or they're wrong and I'm wrong. There's a different cultural context which gives us a different perspective. There's also, of course, our own personal lives that shape the way we meet yoga. And I can only talk from a personal anecdote. As a slightly disorganized young man, I found the discipline of IYN Yoga, which is what I met, very useful. It gave me a structure, gave me something to do, some way of feeling a body that, I was dyslexic. So I was not an embodied child. I was not the kid in school who was I was the last one picked for the football team. So you get used to being in your head and not in your body. That kind of separation that happens when you're told to sit still and not fidget, all those other things we do to help children dissociate. I was, yoga for me was the first time I met my body in a really useful way. I felt myself. I was stretching. I was doing things. This feels good. I like this, and I enjoyed it. I got something from it. And at about the same time, or a few years later, I started studying osteopathy. And, another way of looking at the body, a very analytical way of looking at the body. And actually, the Iyengar system that I was in was also fairly analytical, if I think about it in retrospect. What I was studying then was shapes, how to get people into those shapes. It was a process of cognitively organizing people's bodies into an organization that I was told was useful. this shape or that shape is going to be good for you, and that's fine. And it was very similar with osteopathy. The idea in osteopathy when I was studying it, this was in the end of the 80s, early 90s, that people bend themselves out of shape by life. They do things, they fall over, they hurt themselves, they put bones out, and you put them back in, and you straighten them up. And you can do that, and when you straighten them up, they get better. It took me quite a long time to realise both of these modalities were a bit flawed. They're the studying of things. And it took me a long time, particularly I think, you learn by your failures often. And I've had quite a few. The failures of not getting people better. When you qualify as an osteopath, you think, I think when I first started, I thought I could raise the dead. Something like that. It was you feel very confident. And I quite like the confidence of youth. And I think in yoga, we're a bit in that phase now. You see a lot of yoga people qualifying after a couple of 100 hours and thinking they, you know it all. My son is 17, and I love the confidence he's got in his own knowledge. I mean, it's tiny, but he's very confident with it, and I'm so pleased that he's confident in it, and he's going to be awfully wrong about an awful lot of things. And I keep wanting to tell him, and I keep biting my lip. But you can be very forgiving of a teenager growing up because they're going to make a load of mistakes. And in yoga, I think we do the same thing. Goat yoga, beer yoga, yin and jin. It's probably a big mistake. But, later on, some of those people might find something a bit more serious. They might arrive at another destination. So I'm not worried about all that. I don't mind. I quite like it. When you study bodies, one of the changes that had to be made was the recognition you can't actually do something to somebody and hope to change them. It just doesn't work. Because people control their own lives through their own nervous systems. And you can do whatever you like to the outside of a person, and that person will then reorganize it back to the way they live their life. It doesn't affect them. You might think it does, and it's the same with yoga. You can stretch your bits of your body, but you'll go back to the same organization that your life imposes on your body because you are shaped by your life, not by the structure that contains you. It's not that way round. When we look at our friends and our loved ones, we recognize them from miles away, if we can see them. I do need glasses these days. You recognize them by the shape and their walk. And that shape and their walk is formed by the kind of life they've had. They've defended themselves. They've been open. They've had a bad life in their tents. And that life embeds itself in a body that you recognize and that we feel and we notice in ourselves and in the people we're with. So, I've given up on the idea you can change people from the outside, either by yoga or by osteopathy. And when people run into difficulties, I sometimes tell an anecdote about a man who came to me because he told me he had piriformis syndrome. And that what I should do is work on his piriformis and his quadratus lumborum because that's what his physio had told him. He was in London and he'd moved down to Brighton and his sports massage therapist said, this is what you got to do. Had a whole list of things I had to do to him. And I started doing these things to him, not with much hope. And after about 3 treatments, nothing changed. And I said, when did all this start? He said, about 18 months ago. And I said, well, what happened? 18 months ago, what was the story? He said, well, I don't know. I haven't had an accident, didn't fall over or anything like that. I said, okay, well, what else? He said, well, I don't know. My wife had a baby. I said, well, that's quite a big thing. How's it going? He said, well, it's not great, actually. I said, why is that? He said, well, she's got postnatal depression, and I'm self-employed, and, I find it quite hard now. I've taken 6 weeks off work, but I feel bad when I go to work now because she's at home with a baby and she's crying, And I thought, you poor bloke. I said, that creates a lot of conflict. Of course it creates a lot of conflict. And of course, what happens when you're in conflict is you tense, you become tense. And when you become tense, your muscles grip certain things in your body. And you've patterned that tension many, many years ago when you were quite small, probably somewhere between 0 and 4 years old. And you just play those tensions out. And at some point you get a symptom. And then you blame the piriformis. It's stupid, isn't it? It's not the piriformis, it's the way you engage with life. And we're very good at blaming things, muscles, people, instead of looking at the relationship between things. How am I relating to my body? How am I relating to other people? I like what Andreia said at the end about these different yoga organizations. We can shout at each other and look at other organizations and say how awful they are, or we can start learning about the relationship. How do we relate better? That would be a much more productive way of going on. True with everything and everybody, because that's how change happens. You can't change things from the outside. You can only change things through constructive, competent inquiry, compassionate engagement with another human being or another organization. These are things that create change. And we should be forgiving of the flim-flam that's around yoga, I think, because I think it brings... I started with flim-flam, you know. And the thing that's become very interesting to me as a secular skeptic of yoga is that what I've become much more interested in is experience. So how do I sense and feel and notice myself, my body? How do I notice particularly discomfort? This has become quite a big inquiry for me. It started because you see people in your yoga class sitting with a grimace on their face. And you say, well, how are you feeling? They say, well, it hurts. Why are you still there? Well, you didn't tell me to move. I now say to people, as soon as you notice discomfort, change the position of your leg. It's silly to... If you get a signal from your body saying something's hurting and you ignore it, you can be sure it's going to carry on hurting. Our sensory nervous system, as Andreia was talking about the evolution of consciousness, our sensory nervous system developed to move us away from danger, to comfort. To sense, to notice how we feel is a very important part of our survival. It's not just physical things, but often in yoga that's where it starts. My knee hurts, my back hurts, my neck hurts. It may be the yoga causing your pain. You might be doing something silly in yoga. Then you should stop doing it. It shouldn't be that anything other than that. We also get signals. See, it's not just physical, is it? If ever I have a row with a person, or usually my wife or my son, it's usually the nearest and dearest, you say a crossword or something, and then you kind of walk away and you go, I don't really feel good about that, and there's a little knot somewhere in your stomach, and it's a feeling. And it's about homeostasis. It's about how can we soothe ourselves, how can we reduce conflict? And we get signals all the time alerting us to the fact that there is a conflict. And these are always uncomfortable feelings. If we notice them, I can go back and say, I'm sorry. I can go back and say, I think I oversaid that. Or maybe I'll reflect on it and think, no, actually what I said was perfectly fine. I think it was them. I might reflect on it. That might be the way it was. But there will be some discomfort because of the conflict and the discord. And the capacity to notice and pay attention to how we feel seems to me a very significant one. And it's the pursuit that I'm on at the moment. When I feel uncomfortable, I want to understand my discomfort and I want to help resolve it. And it's nearly always through understanding the discord in a relationship. Not the person or the thing that's the problem, but it's how they relate. And as Andreia so nicely ended her talk, I would second it and say, if we can do anything, the capacity to learn to converse, to talk to each other, to listen with kind ears and not hostile ones. There's a lot of hostile listening going on out there. Predatory listening, I've heard it called. I don't like it. I think it's very divisive. Listen with kind ears. That's my final statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Are you going down? Yes. Okay. And now we have Susan Swanwick, who's going to talk about yoga. Sorry, would you like to say that yourself?
Sorry, did you see the cringe?
Repeat your name for me, Susan.
Right, Suzanne.
Susan, who's going to talk about yoga for health.
Thank you. Right, thank you for that introduction. I'm making this presentation on behalf of the whole team of trustees for the Yoga for Health Foundation. And the title, as you can see, is Remedial Yoga or Yoga Therapy in the context of Yoga for Health. So Yoga for Health, well, it's in our name. I intend to give you a brief background of the Yoga for Health and Education Trust, our origins in the Yoga for Health Foundation, our arisings as the Trust, what we do now, and what lies in store, please. So Howard Kent visited New York in 1967. Subsequently, he made a television series about yoga with Richard Hittleman. Many people saw that on television. He then set up the Yoga for Health Foundation and in 1978 leased it Wilber as a dedicated residential centre for yoga. The ethos of the Yoga for Health Foundation was to make yoga available for all people. To do this, we held residential courses for teacher training, twice annual instructor weekends for continuing development. The first remedial yoga teacher training course was actually in 1979. We have somebody in this room who was on it. I won't embarrass her. A club system was run by teachers for ordinary members, and we ran residential weekends for club members. Residential breaks were also organised for people with specific ailments, such as Parkinson's, MS, breathing difficulties, etc., so the pace of the class could be relative to the needs of the group, so that they could compare their problems and have joint solutions. But Wilber was leased. It was sold by the owners, and after 28 years of continuous provision of yoga for everybody, the lease ceased. So a group of IYN instructors and some former Yoga for Health Club teachers all got together to form a new group, the Yoga for Health and Education Trust, to continue the ethos that yoga should be made available for everyone. Now, in our logo, the throat chakra was chosen to show that desire to communicate our belief that yoga is for all, even including those with terminal illness. And we're fully democratic, our officers are voted for. So what do we do? Well, we hold residential continuing professional development courses twice a year. We hold residential yoga breaks at various locations about the country. We'd like it to extend. We run residential remedial yoga breaks. We subsidise residential remedial yoga breaks, publish a quarterly magazine, and maintain a website with information relevant to yoga. So what's going to happen? Well, we'd like to continue to run our quality CBPD courses, continue to run and expand both the remedial and other residential courses, hopefully increasing the venues around the country. It's our intention to develop further training courses, in particular the remedial teacher training, to make use of that 28 years of experience from IYN of working with people with illnesses, some of them severe. We intend to liaise with charities associated with different illnesses to discuss specific needs. And what else? Who knows? To parody a film, the future is not written yet. What do we mean by yoga? We need to know that. There's many branches. I'm not going to list them. You can read them and know of many more. But here in Britain, people seem to think of the Hatha Yoga as the default system. And many people are unaware of other types of yoga. And it's my belief that the easy visibility of the yoga postures and the nature of celebrities doing yoga on television has led to the situation of yoga almost being seen as slow gymnastics. Now, I apologise for my pronunciations. In the Hatha Pradipika, Svatnamara wrote, "I bow to the Almighty, who taught the law of Hatha Yoga, which is held in high esteem, as if it were a flight of steps leading up to the highest peaks of Raja Yoga. Now, in Hatha Yoga, the body is cleansed, we unblock the energy centres, we purify, do all these things prior to the practice of asana, pranayama, mudra, and hopefully onwards. Thus, it's a method of preparing the system for spiritual awakening. And Patanjali begins his sutras with yoga is the restriction of fluctuations of consciousness. In other words, asana, pranayama, etc., and all other aspects of Hatha Yoga are inextricably bound up with the deepening control of consciousness. Yoga postulates its aim is to reach that state known as samadhi. We could call that fulfillment. To go anywhere, to do anything, we need to follow a path, which means we have to start with ourselves here and now. We need to work our way through the moral discipline and ethics of the yamas. We need to look at the niyamas, need to follow that self-control. Then we can come to the third limb. We can practice our seat, our posture of stability to enable us to be comfortable for withdrawing our senses, for meditation, hopefully, eventually, to reach that enlightenment. So coming back to the title of this presentation, Remedial Yoga or Yoga Therapy. What is in a name? Why remedial? Why not use the word remedial, the word therapy, and other interpretations? Why choose the word remedial in the first place? It's an adjective meaning to improve. A remedial action is intended to correct something that is wrong or to improve a bad situation, from the Cambridge Dictionary. So it's a means of counteracting or removing anything undesirable, or rectifying, making good. In relation to yoga, we need to remedy the condition that we have got ourselves into, be it disease, behavioural problems, mental problems, imbalance, pain, suffering. We basically need to restore our body to its natural state. Now, Howard Kent carefully chose that word remedial for yoga suitable for people with illness or disease. He would argue that all people need remedial yoga, since few people have achieved balance, harmony, or union in body, mind, spirit, or reach that state of bliss. Why not use the word remedial? Well, that word, unfortunately, was associated with children in schools who found learning and academic work difficult. And the thoughts of many people go to this first when hearing the word remedial. Therapy, well, that's a noun defined as a treatment that helps someone feel better, grow stronger, etc., especially after an illness. Again, from the Cambridge Dictionary. So in other words, it's a curative medical treatment. So is yoga more than a means to make us feel better? Maybe we could continue to debate this and could conclude that yes, it could be. Should we be so careful about the name? Maybe we need to look at what the public consciousness understands by therapy. We've so many therapies today where somebody else is doing something for you. What the public psyche relates to is just that even though the definition makes no reference to another person being involved, and other names being used for this kind of generality of yoga are recovery, restorative, renewing, gentle, etc. But do these describe it adequately? Even gentle yoga can be too strong for those with fatigue or the chronic fatigue, which is prevalent in so many illnesses. So remedial yoga. Yoga seeks to remedy the conditioning which stands between people and their own natural state. It doesn't mean that such a goal can be achieved by asanas or even by correct regulation of the breath. A form must be found in which the total concept of yoga can be got across, the understanding of that integration which is life. The only real meaning which can be given to the phrase remedial yoga is a consideration not of symptoms, but of causes. The amelioration of symptoms, it doesn't happen until causes are faced up to. So to perform exercises under the name of yoga is totally absurd. It's like mistaking the act of weeding for the total practice of gardening. Neither that nor the exercises will achieve the whole objective. So the yoga remedial practitioner is not a yoga doctor, physiotherapist, nurse, therapist, because he or she does not offer treatments. And it can never be too strongly emphasized that yoga is never a matter of what asana is good for. So we can look at the path of remedial yoga. And as a human being, with free will, we can choose to take that path of morality. We can choose to respect life and cause no harm, to not be violent. We can choose to be truthful, to not steal, to be abstinent, and to not be greedy. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
No. Right. Sorry, just to bore you with a few photos. In this, you could call it Asana Practice. The tutor is actually practicing compassion by not encouraging the participants to go into positions that their bodies would be uncomfortable in. They also are practicing ahimsa by not harming themselves. And satya, truthfulness. These participants are showing the truthfulness about their own physical ability, with some choosing not to take an inverted posture. Continuing the path of remedial yoga, as a human being with free will, we can choose to follow the niyamas. So we can practice cleanliness of our mind as well as our body. We can be content. We can be austere if we need to be. I think that maybe is not a word we would use in English. We can practice study, and I can't read the last writing there. And we can contemplate on all that is spiritual. Sorry. So here,
A minute left.
thank you. Here we have a gentle forward bend by some of the participants in a remedial group, being content with as they are now. And asana, coming onto the third limb of yoga. Postures practiced to enable sitting for extended periods. No, they haven't all got their fingers up their noses. They're practicing alternate nostril breathing, Pranayama, the breath of life. This is a perfect asana. This participant is practicing, she's stable posture, ready to withdraw her senses from the outside environment. So as a human with free will, we can hope that by following that yogic path, we may reach beyond with the withdrawal of our senses, reach our ultimate goal through concentration, expansion of concentration into consciousness. Thank you to the ancient sages who developed the path of yoga. Each person who has taught me and guided me on my yogic path, the organisers of this conference, you for listening. I leave you in peace.
Thank you, Suzanne. Well, how juicy it's going so far, and what a wonderful, diverse and different, understanding experience of yoga that we all have. And I'm starting to feel a bit of a thread coming through of this community within that understanding, the difference in understanding that we all have. There's a wanting to come together. So I'm starting to feel that now. Let's see how we go for the rest of the afternoon. But right now, has anyone got any questions? And with the questions, please be as clear and as concise as possible. If not, you may be stopped.
Thank you. Professor Ravindra, who is both a physicist and a theologian, noted that every spiritual teacher and yogi and swami who spoke was delighted if he was on the stage with them, not for his theological or philosophical knowledge, but because he was a scientist, and everything these days needs scientific endorsement. And it's just fantastic that in the last 2 decades, you guys are stepping up to the plate and validating what we've been doing for thousands of years. I'm very old, so I've met some older monks than the one who said yoga has nothing to do with mysticism. And one of them was a monk called Swami Krishnananda, who had written many books, and every time I went to visit him, there would be a group of scientists sitting at his feet, and who would have come from England or the States to see him. On one particular occasion, 3 scientists came from Harvard, all physicists. They thanked him profusely for his writing, explained that they'd come all the way from Harvard to Rishikesh in the Himalayas to see him. It was a particularly bad winter, and presented him with books they had written, and he very graciously accepted them. And then one of them said, "Swamiji, we feel through reading your works that the path of yoga and the path of science ultimately are going to reach the same point. Would you agree?" And he said, "Absolutely not." They were surprised, having read his work. I was stunned. They were so stunned they didn't ask why. I recovered myself quick enough. He was a loving person, but also an extremely grumpy one. And as I get older, I so understand that. I did, though, pluck up the courage to say, "Swamiji, why not?" And here's my question to you. He said, because in science, you have to objectify. To study a thing, it has to be an object, a thing that you study. Yoga is, in fact, mysticism, because you cannot objectify that which you are reaching for. You, in fact, have to die in order to experience it. So I wonder if you could comment.
Would anyone in particular like to comment first? Suzanne?
First and foremost, you have to realise that science is a belief system. We believe what we see, we believe what we understand, what we find out. But by the scientific method of inquiry is somebody puts forward a suggestion, a theory, which other people then test to destruction. So there is a theory which then has to be nullified. Nothing is ever proved correct. All that happens is that we believe that something is something until somebody else has proved it wrong. That is the method of scientific inquiry.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
So in Zen practice, we have, as I assume there is similarly in sort of Raja Yoga practice, the sort of methods for coming to wake up. And my Zen teacher, when I first started, to me, presented it in a sort of scientific way of doing it. So this is the method, the laboratory is your body, and what you find, your conclusions are your conclusions, And I've probably seen many, many people apply those methods in their own body and find who they really are. And to me it seems very sort of straightforward. And maybe someone mentioned earlier this morning that yoga is perhaps the mother of all science, in that there's a method and there's a human body, and when you apply the method to the human body, you wake up. And so that to me is science.
Yes, of course.
There's just a couple of things that came to mind when you were talking. One is with the new developments in quantum physics, which I don't begin really to understand, but it questions the idea that science can never be truly objective. That's one thing. And another interesting thing is I'm quite interested in the new sciences that are coming through, and one of them is phenomenology, which again I'm no expert in, but it's to do with the study of experience, which to me seems to overlap quite a lot with yoga, which I've always thought of as a kind of subjective science. Not an answer, but...
So I recently read the Pratibhignya Hridaya, and one chapter that I really like in it is where Simaraja basically sort of lists all of the other doctrines that he's comparing to his own. And without saying, this doctrine is better because we reach this higher point, he basically says all of these other doctrines drop out at whatever the point that their top range of belief is. So I would say that for the majority of scientists, perhaps they're not even looking to reach the same goal as yoga practice. But were those scientists truly looking to attain the same goal as yoga practice, then eventually their methods would bring them to a place where they would have to change that line of query, or inquiry even, to something that allowed them to continue to progress. And potentially at that point...
Cease to be science and become mysticism.
Potentially, yes. But then my argument would be that, does it matter whether it started as science, or does it matter whether it started as mysticism, if actually the goal is the same? Yeah.
I'm quite a fan of science. I think it's very useful. I think the interrelationship between Eastern mysticism and Western science, I think like this, black and white terms, of course, are quite useful. I think science has done some things very well. We've all got light, we're all warm, we all got here in cars and on trains. Mine was cancelled. So, I value what science has given us. And it's a certain, with its logic and reason, it's lifted us out of superstitious thinking, burning of witches and those kind of things. I think this is a very important thing that science has given us. And what the East has given us is an ability to introspect. And I think those two things are very useful to bring together. So I rather like the idea that you've got two, I think Stephen Jay Gould called them two different magisteria. And perhaps they are, I'm not entirely sure. But I wouldn't want to be without science, and I wouldn't want to be without introspection. I think these are two things that human beings value greatly. And perhaps bringing introspection to science will make us use it more usefully and less destructively, and I think that will be a good thing for all of us. Oh. So it's not that I think they're in conflict. I think they could harmonize very helpfully for humankind.
Great, thanks. Another question? Over here at the back. And can you just say your name and how long you've been practicing, I think?
Hi everyone, bear with me, I'm a little nervous. So I'm Jenny. I became certified in 2014 and I've set up the not-for-profit Animalia Asana initiative. And I really just have a comment, really. I really enjoyed the focus on human evolution. I kind of incorporate that into my sessions that I teach. I just wanted to add a comment, really, about broadening our circle of compassion to include non-human animals as well, ourselves being one member of the animal kingdom out of however many millions. And just whenever we do focus on compassion and love within our sessions, just to perhaps not restrict it to humanity. Our brains ultimately evolved from a jellyfish. There's huge interconnection between all species, and within yogic philosophy and mythology, the idea is that there is a divinity or a soul within every species as well. That's just my little encouragement.
Great, thank you. Do any of you want to comment on that? Well, enough said.
I think enough said.
Absolutely.
Great. Any more questions? Yep, the lady over here in the green.
My name's Karen Patterson. I come from Somerset. So we've had a lot of talk about evolution, which I've found very interesting. And we've heard how people have evolved over millions of years physically, and then obviously we've evolved mentally as well. And we've also heard a lot about yoga tradition and practices which are very ancient. We've now heard about science, which is something much more new. So there's been a whole change in human consciousness, human ways of thinking over the millennia. And presumably that change is still continuing into the future. So I think one of the dangers is that if we go too far into the future, we can become totally science, and only see things very rationally, and we lose a sense of spiritual awareness. We've also lost a sense of community, and things like morality have been mentioned. At the same time, there could potentially be a danger that when we're practicing yoga, we are trying to take ourselves backwards more into a kind of consciousness that people had thousands of years ago. So my question to the panel, and I think particularly to Chris more than anybody else, but to everybody, please, because Chris, you mentioned about a next stage of human development, and I found that concept quite interesting. And I wrote down the term that you used, syncotropic cooperation or something like that, and implying that actually human beings can develop to something new, that we don't just need to be looking back at an ancient form of consciousness or at an ancient form of morality or compassion or things that we have already learnt about from the past, but that human beings can develop new potential, new qualities. And I'd be interested to know what you and the rest of the panel feel that those qualities would be, and how we can encourage them in a modern yoga practice.
Well, the bit that I sort of had to cut very short was that the model put together by Buckminster Fuller shows a progression through a lifetime, and it also shows a progression through stages of history, where that the highest stages are the most integrated stages, whether that's inter or sort of extra-personally. The phrase then was from Buckminster Fuller, and this idea that actually there is the possibility that we could evolve to the point that we are genuinely cooperating, and that cooperation for a communal progress is far greater than where we currently are, which is very sort of egocentric and essentially moving increasingly disparately. So for me, and I think it's really been echoed by almost all of the talks this morning, is this idea that a centralizing of some kind is needed, whereby there isn't a negation or an overwriting as such, but an acceptance of commonality, an acceptance of individual differences, and an understanding that actually the future is far more promising if we can coordinate those things and we can cooperate on those things. Not from a place that is a calculated cooperation, but that is a genuine shift in our perceptual systems, just in the same way that a baby is unable to comprehend that there are other people than itself. You know, there are inferior stages more integral than the stages that we can already identify, whether that's sort of developmental and humanistic psychology, whether it's sort of religious discourse.
Do you know what those are?
Not yet.
Do you know what those are?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
I think it will be a steady process. I think that Peter sort of warning that there needs to be some sort of catastrophe first is probably ominously true in that scenario. That actually we probably do need something significant enough for us to make that paradigm shift.
Yeah.
I think it's happening already. I think we have technology. We're going through, the historians say we're going through the fourth industrial revolution at the moment, the communication revolution. And the fact that we are now all connected via the internet changes us hugely. And who knows how that's going to develop. I mean, you know, say Mark Zuckerberg on TV the other week, trying to negotiate the problems arising out of this whole new concept. And I see things changing hugely in that direction. Maybe it doesn't need to be a catastrophe, maybe it could be a catastrophe, or maybe it's just that, you know, just the increase in technology, communications, and how we deal with that. Take the good things from it and deal with the negative, perhaps.
We're all, I think all human beings struggle at some point with probably the evolutionary problem of the fear of strangers and difference. I think this is something that, you know, the tribalism has troubled us throughout our history, the wars with other people, the arguments with difference. And as I was trying to imply earlier on in my talk, that communication and dialogue, the way we relate to each other, seems to me the thing we need to concentrate on. And, you know, what you've just said, Andreia, although a lot of people would probably disagree about social media at the moment, it does have the potential. You know, it's very interesting to notice that most of things like racism and differences and violence between cultures doesn't happen so much in cities because people are pressed up against each other. You get to tolerate each other because you're present with them all the time. The people who are most scared of difference are the people who live in the country and don't see it all the time. You find the most reactionary people there. So the more we are connected, the more we are confronted with each other, the more we get a chance to break down our tribal barriers. And that can only be a good thing. The more interconnected we are, I suspect, will lead in a positive direction, but who knows?
Would anyone else like to comment? No, that's fine. Okay, another question. Yeah. Could you just say your name?
My name is Manisha. I'm from Traditional Yoga Association. My question is for Pete. If I understood you correctly, you said at some point that you hadn't had any experience of the chakras. That's right. And my question is, how do you know, and can you be sure that you haven't had any experience of the chakras? Yeah, and the background to my question is this, that there is a stereotype. One of the stereotypes about yoga and people who do yoga is this business about chakras. And I share your skepticism about a lot of people who say, oh, I've had a chakra experience, I've done this and done that. And really they're talking rubbish. and assuming things that they have not in fact experienced. But the opposite can be true as well, because if we don't know what we are looking for, we sometimes can't find it. And there's a way in which the thinking of all of us is tied up with all kinds of stereotypes and preconceptions and labels. And I think one of the things that's common to both yoga and science is to reject labels and stereotypes and preconceptions and investigate what is actually happening. And with regard to the chakras are really a classic example, along with many other things, of yoga as a science. There is a whole body of inquiry and definition about what is involved in the chakras, and that have to do with healing and human development and so on. But you made the point that the West can offer science and the East can offer introspection. I think that's selling both sides short, but I think it's also it's also an example of how you have certain labels that you're operating on the basis of. And what I'm saying in questioning whether or not you have experienced the chakras is that observing you and listening to you and how you have evolved, to me, I can see an opening and an activation of different chakras at different points in your life, which have brought you to a point of a certain level of broad-mindedness. So you may actually be missing out on what your own experience has been because of how you are labeling or failing to label it.
That's very kind of you. I think there are a couple of things you said there, which I want to meet you here because I think this is a language thing. You have experiences. Some people call them chakras. Some people call them, I don't know. People talk about energy in their body. Well, you can talk about tingling. You can talk about warmth. You can refine the language. I could talk about grief. I could talk about love. They're experiences that I feel in my body. They're not out here. They're in here. All experiences are somatic as far as I understand it. And nobody experiences any feelings anywhere other than in their body. How you label them is a cultural thing. You call them, you say, you kindly tell me I may have experienced some chakras, and I may respond by saying I've had some sense of human development in my life. It's just another framing, and what I'm interested in is that we don't argue about it, that we understand that we're talking about the same thing. I am interested, I'm deeply interested in that people learn to know. Is that I've got to stop speaking? Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm deeply interested in the noticing of conflicts that arise in us and how we deal with those conflicts. But we have to notice them, and they're always noticed somatically, before thoughtfully, I think. If we don't notice them, we can't deal with them. Now, whether you call them a chakra, whether I call them a development in my personal growth or anybody else's, I think is arbitrary. I don't mind what language we use. The common language is the one of experience. That's how I see it.
Thank you very much, speakers, questioners. We have just a 10-minute break and we'll be back here. Yep.